Hello and welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey. On this episode, we speak with Building Transformations President and CEO Thomas Strong about the organization's upcoming ESG Summit in Vancouver, as well as the issues faced by stakeholders looking to get structures to net zero. But first, here's the latest headlines from the Daily Commercial News and the Journal of Commerce. We have a story from correspondent Don Proctor about Timber Fever, the annual design build competition in Toronto that teams up architectural and civil engineering students from various universities. It celebrated its 9th edition with a project theme relevant to the times in the city, an accessible transit shelter connected to a protected bicycle storage space. Held recently at Toronto Metropolitan University, the 3-day competition saw students from 10 Canadian universities and 14 teams race against the clock to design and then construct their projects, each designed for a specific street intersection in Toronto. New funding has been announced to support energy efficiency studies in Hamilton, Ontario. The federal government is putting $335,000 through the Green Municipal Fund to support 2 feasibility studies aimed at improving energy efficiency in Hamilton. Hamilton Community Enterprises will receive $175,000 to study the commercial and technical viability of a district energy system that will use residual industrial heat as a fuel source for a proposed low-carbon thermal corridor. And the City of Hamilton will receive $160,000 to develop a home retrofit financing program that will encourage energy efficiency improvements, including fuel switching, air sealing, insulation, and the purchasing of power-saving appliances. Daily Commercial News staff writer Angela Gismondi has a story about how structural steel reuse is assisting with sustainability for the massive center block rehab project on Parliament Hill. In her presentation, Practical Considerations for the Reuse of Structural Steel at the Canadian Institute of Steel Construction Conference in Toronto, structural engineer Isis Bennett used the project as a case study. Quote, "The steel that is being removed is what we've identified as a big opportunity to take the steel where it needs to be demolished and bring it back into this exact same project in a new construction phase," she said, in order to take advantage of embodied carbon. From the West, the Manitoba election on October 3rd made history as NDP leader Wab Kinew became the first First Nations premier in Canada's history. Now former Premier Heather Stephenson announced she'd step down from the helm of the Progressive Conservatives after several of her cabinet members lost their seats in Winnipeg. The provincial capital holds 32 of the 57 legislature seats. Manitoba Liberal leader Dougald Lamont resigned after he lost his own Winnipeg riding, and his party was reduced to 1 seat from the previous 3. And I have a story about how an uptick in mental health and diabetes is driving benefit costs up. I spoke to Independent Contractors and Businesses Association President Chris Gardner about what can be done to adopt benefits plans to these changing realities, as well as addressing the root causes and providing access to mental health programs and changing workplace culture. And that's it for the headlines. Here's our interview with Thomas Strong. We're going to talk in 2 parts. For one, we're going to talk about a summit you're holding in Vancouver on the 11th and 12th. But before that, we're going to kind of go in the background of why this summit needs to exist in the first place. Starting with, you're looking at, well, Building Transformations used to be CAN-BIM, and it's sort of concentrated on BIM and various other permutations of that. And now it seems like you've expanded a bit. So this conference in particular is about ESG reporting, net zero, and how digital transformation kind of ties into all that. So maybe you could tell us how that does tie into it.
Yeah, well, thanks for that, and thanks so much for the opportunity to tell people about this upcoming event. We think it's super important. As you mentioned, the organization used to be called CAN-BIM. We formed in 2008, and the organization is a not-for-profit focused on improving our civilization, essentially. So we have a lot of stakeholders from the building industry, from developers, engineers, architects, municipalities, federal participation, and a lot of the sort of technology developers that are creating new solutions and bringing them to market. So our organization tends to be the people that are kind of driving innovation, driving improvement within their organization, and it's a really energetic group of people, very like-minded, that get together and discuss how we can improve overall. And we kind of revamped the organization from CAN-BIM to Building Transformations because it better fits what we're doing. We've always been kind of focused on process improvement and implementing new technologies. And BIM is a foundational tool that's being used in the industry to analyze buildings and look at things like net zero and analyze projects. And perfect them before you go and build. But the technology is much broader than that. There's quite a few different systems that help us to understand all sorts of activities on job sites and help to optimize the project before it actually gets built. So we're really trying to drive transformational change in the industry, and the organization does have a U.S. Canada membership, so the new branding really works for that purpose. And we're doing several events per year. We're aiming to do one major event every quarter, and each event has a kind of a different focus, but all kind of the same thread all the way through. In that we're trying to improve and innovate. And we just finished a really great event in Toronto focused on construction technology. This upcoming event in Vancouver is focused on our members that are really focused on sustainability and net zero. And this event in Vancouver is really geared for developers, architects, engineers, general contractors that are looking to understand how to implement net zero strategies within their organization. Not only for themselves to kind of bring their organization up to a higher level of performance from an environmental and sustainability standpoint, but also how to improve the product that we're delivering. Buildings are responsible for a huge percentage of the overall global emissions on planet Earth, and we just got to do better. We got to build our buildings in a more efficient way to produce less greenhouse gases during the construction process, and we have to build a better product that performs better, whether it's energy consumption or emissions or ultimately power generation on site, which is, I think, the new wave of performance.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Is in your literature you cite, I mean, it's not the biggest. I think oil and gas and those sort of things are the bigger emitters of gas, but commercial real estate's up there as far as GHGs go. And so, how does digital tie into that in terms of because I think that is still a driving force. BIM and all the other foundational stuff you talked about. How does that fit into getting things down to net zero for commercial real estate?
Yeah, well, I mean, ultimately all of this technology and digital strategies, we're really talking about our tools, and the better tools and better processes help us to perform better. So, we can use different technologies to analyze our designs to make sure that they're going to perform from an environmental standpoint in the best way possible, whether that's in understanding, the building envelope and making sure that you produce a very tight building envelope that meets or exceeds requirements, but also looking at doing analysis on the building related to energy consumption itself. And then I think the new wave of tracking is understanding where down in the supply chain where your carbon is embodied, like how much energy is being consumed to produce the steel or concrete or even mass timber products that your building's going to use, and figure out ways to track that so you can report on it. So having those digital systems in place to understand your supply chain and coordinate with all your suppliers, I think is going to be fundamental to measuring, and you can't manage what you can't measure. So that's a very important part of this whole process.
One thing I was going to ask is the pandemic changed everything, and nobody wanted it to happen. But one of the things that came out of it was a lot less people were going into offices, which meant those offices were presumably getting used less, which meant presumably less emissions. So how does stuff like COVID-19 or other black swan events, for that matter, how do they affect your calculations in terms of, or do you just kind of stay the course because these buildings have to lower emissions anyway?
Well, I mean, it goes without saying, COVID-19 had a huge disruptive effect on commercial real estate landscape. Buildings have lost a tremendous amount of value because as vacancies climb, the buildings have less value, less tenants, less revenue, and there's a cascading effect there. And I'm not, I'd be not an expert on this subject. I'm not an economist, but certainly one would expect that to level out over time as we all sort of move back to the office. But I do think that the net effect overall is that more people are going to be working from home, which is potentially better for the environment in that we're not consuming or producing more emissions to get to and from work, and potentially those buildings will have less consumption on site. Now, we have all these assets that are built already that are potentially higher vacancy rates, and it obviously it uses less energy and it consumes less carbon to utilize something that already exists. So I think there's going to be a big market for retrofits and repurposing of these assets and changing them to different purposes. I think, again, I'm not an expert in this subject matter, but when you kind of stand back and look at it, obviously, assets that are in downtown locations and high urban density areas, those things are going to retain their value. They get repurchased a little bit or repurposed a little bit. But you could see some of these office towers and office complexes being repurposed into, say, who knows, like data centers or vertical farming or, using I think there's going to be a broader market for that sort of like retrofit work that's going to be coming to market. And I think there's going to be a lot of demand for expertise in the market on how do we repurpose these buildings? How do we make them perform better? How do we add energy production capability on site, whether it's through solar or other mechanisms, or just putting in heat pumps and other kind of more efficient energy systems. And that's kind of the broad impact of COVID-19. I think there's probably a lot more other things other than that, but certainly you can see that kind of happening in the market right now.
And let's go to something that I'm pretty sure you are an expert in, which is this 2-day event that's coming up on the 11th to 12th. So maybe you can kind of give us the broad strokes of what that's going to be all about.
Yeah, so I mean, there's kind of two parts to it. I mean, if you go to our website at buildingtransformations.org, you'll find information on the main event, which is October 11th and 12th, and that's happening at the UBC campus in Vancouver, BC. And it should be, I mean, it's just a beautiful campus if you've never been there, and a great place to visit, and all sorts of really interesting architecture to look at, including a lot of mass timber projects. So that in itself is an attraction. But the people that are going to be attending this are people that are focused on ESG in the building industry. So it's going to be a combination of architects, engineers, developers, owners that are all focused on the same problem of how do we make buildings more efficient? How do we add technology, add systems, improve the assets themselves? But also, what can we do using technology to improve the process and measure what we're doing? So that's kind of like the first part. Like we have this big main event, and there's also, and interestingly, it's not on our website, but we have this kind of closed door meeting that's happening off to the side of the event. That is a group of construction, engineering, architects, a lot of executives from around the building industry, as well as municipal, probably all levels of government, actually, like provincial and federal representatives there, that are having a kind of a workshop to talk about what action can be taken right now, and not waiting for federal requirements or other requirements, but what can the industry do right now to create meaningful change in how we're operating. And we're going to have, there's quite a few individuals from supply chain there, is from major concrete, steel, wood industry, et cetera, that are getting together to discuss this. So that's kind of an interesting thing that's happening up to the side. And that's kind of the beauty of our organization. We have a lot of people that are practitioners that are implementing, new technologies, driving innovation within their organizations. But we also have these relationships with these executives, and we're bringing them together to talk with each other to try to drive change immediately. So that's kind of interesting. In addition to that, we have a series of site tours that are happening. We rent coach buses and we bring people around a job site, which is always popular. And there's a number of other networking opportunities like dinners and whatnot happening. So it should be really a fun event, and I'm excited for the speaker lineup. We've got a lot of expertise from around the world, really, talking about strategies that they are implementing within their own organizations. We've got some great roundtable discussions with different representatives from, all sorts of different perspectives, including finance and surety and technology. So it's a kind of an interesting mix, and I think that's what's kind of unique about our organization. We're a not-for-profit, and we don't represent a single interest group within the industry. Like, we don't represent just general contractors, for example. We represent, our membership is constituted of a variety of different perspectives, so we can kind of talk broadly about overall process and how to create change. So I'm super excited for the event. I think it's gonna be a good one.
Now, I know you're going to say all the speakers are great, but if you had to pick one or two, like highlight keynote ones that people should not miss, what would those be?
Yeah, well, you're putting me on the spot here to call out. I mean, it's obviously we have some great keynotes happening. So we have Ben Kopp, you've seen a director from the Office of Energy Efficiencies from Natural Resources Canada. I think that should be really interesting. And we also have I guess James Burrow, Director of Sustainability Finance at the Bank of Montreal. Jamie Webb, President and CEO of United Nations Association of Canada. They're kind of an interesting group. Their objective is to help drive awareness around different initiatives that the United Nations is taking from Canada's perspective, and try to drive awareness around that and act as a sounding board to bring Canada's perspective to the United Nations. So pretty interesting to have that those types of perspectives at the table.
And one of the things I looked at in the program was I noticed there's a lot of stuff on data and digitization, and there's also stuff about the real world challenges. Now, I know those two things probably mixed together a bit, but maybe you could talk about what are the challenges for data and digitization, and what are the other real world challenges that people face when they're trying to do ESG and net zero?
Sure. I mean, I always kind of look at it, like the problem with change in any organization, whether you're trying to drive change around your process or implementing new technologies, the biggest challenge isn't the software, it isn't the concepts, it's the hearts and minds. It's getting individuals on the ground to care, to make the change, and that's the difficult part. So yeah, the data and digitization, I mean, these are like when you're implementing new technologies, that can be broadly for a lot of different purposes. But obviously, if you're trying to drive targets around ESG or net zero, you've got to implement some technology to be able to measure what you're doing, and potentially implement some new technologies related to the actual asset, how the project is controlled or measured. Or implementing or installing, intelligent systems or like solar systems and other systems that generate electricity. So there's a whole bunch of related problems there related to getting all this new technology to be optimized and perform. So that's part of that sort of digitization strategy. Buildings are getting more and more sophisticated. There's a lot of data related to assets that you need to maintain to be able to maintain those assets. And then if you have a really sophisticated system to manage your building, like your heating and cooling system, then you need to have a lot of sensors and other strategies related to IoT. So, maintaining your data related to your asset, measuring and getting all these systems talking to each other, that's part of digitizing your assets, right? So there's a lot of initiatives in place with organizations that manage a lot of assets to optimize their buildings and implement new systems so they can get them operating perfectly, and then trying to simplify that so you can maintain those buildings and control them in an efficient way by sort of digitizing the assets. Yeah, and then I guess from like the practical part is, if you're an organization, you're providing services, you're selling a product of some sort, so you've got to keep the organization running smoothly while driving some new initiatives around ESG, and that's a hearts and minds problem, right? So I think driving awareness and getting clients interested in this subject matter. So if you're a general contractor, you're positioned well to be able to provide these new types of services, but also you have that sort of external facing initiative, but also internally saying, okay, what are we doing internally here that we can improve upon, whether it's energy consumption or looking inwards and trying to figure out how to optimize your own operations from this perspective.
Okay, and finally, if people are interested in going to the conference, and I imagine they will be after listening to this, where should they go to find more information?
Yeah, definitely the best place to go is our website, buildingtransformations.org. And you can navigate there to our events section. It's pretty easy to find the information there. You can also check us out on YouTube, LinkedIn, pretty much every social media channel we have a presence on, and we put out information there. And you can also subscribe to our newsletter, which is easy to do. You just go to the bottom of our website, and you should be able to just sign up there, and then you can keep posted on all of our events.
Okay, great. Thanks for joining us today, Thomas.
Okay, great. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
And that's it for this episode of the Construction Record Podcast. You can hear us on Spotify, Apple Music, and Amazon Music, as well as on our daily commercial news and Journal of Commerce websites. Thanks for listening.